Morning, Gabi. The HL work for today is about the economic influences of superpowers. I've set some reading and some questions via Cognity, but I would suggest maybe just listen to this recording of me doing the reading and don't bother with the questions. I think it'll be a bit complicated, and they're not particularly complicated questions anyway, so it might be a bit of a waste of time. So I'll just read you the stuff from Cognity for today, and hopefully that works out okay. Give us an email if there's any problems though. Okay, so today's reading is the economic influences of superpowers. And it says, a strong economy and a strong currency are necessary for the emergence, persistence and global influence of a superpower. These and some other significant indicators of economic power and influence are considered below. Key demographic and economic indicators for China and the USA. So there's a little table here, and it shows you that in terms of their rank in the world, national land area, the USA comes third and China fourth. In terms of their population size, the USA comes fourth and China comes first. For their GDP per capita, the USA comes third and China first. That was their GDP. This is GDP per capita. This is quite interesting because it says per capita, the USA is 18th in the world, but for China they're 104th, obviously because their population is so massive. The value of their exports, the US comes third in the world and China second. The value of their imports switches that one around, so for the US it's second and China is third. The value of stock of foreign direct investment at home, the US is second and China is fifth. The value of stock of FDI abroad, the US is second and China is 11th. And then the total value of centrally held financial reserves, the US comes 19th and China first, which is interesting. Which is apparently based on gold and dollar equivalents in trillions of US dollars. Wowza. So it says in table 1, which is the figures I've just talked to you about, they give the world ranking. All the figures are estimates for 2016, except obviously for land area and financial reserves. And the source of data there was the CIA and BIMAP. It says, be aware, the figures for are adjusted for purchasing power parity. Unadjusted or raw figures for 2016 show that the USA is still ahead of China. In 2016, the USA accounted for 24.5% of global GDP, while China accounted for 15%. China is expected to overtake the USA in its contribution to global GDP in 2018. I don't know what would have happened with that now though. Sorry about that. Some definitions here. GDP, gross domestic product, a measure of national income. A similar measure, the gross national income or GNI, is favoured in some analysis. PPP is purchasing power parity. It adjusts the actual GDP to take account of national prices which vary from country to country. $10 in the USA will buy far less than $10 in Tanzania. It doesn't talk about this here, but there's also the Big Mac Index. The Big Mac Index is quite a good indicator of how much money is really worth in countries, and it just tells you the cost of a Big Mac in all the different countries around the world. FDI is foreign direct investment. Alternatively, it's called ODI, which is overseas direct investment. Investments which are made by the government, financial institutions and corporations of one country into the economic sectors of another. Okay, now there's a little graph and it shows the US and Chinese contribution to global GDP purchasing power parity. The blue line is rising from 1980 to 2015, from about 2.5% to just over 20%, and that is China's growth. So in that 35-year period, that is basically about an 18% growth, which is insane, really. It's huge. And obviously, since the open door policy in 1986, I think, when China opened itself to external markets, that massive sort of takeoff on the graph has happened. The red line is the USA, and in 1980 it starts at about 22.5% contribution to global GDP, and it sort of fluctuates but stays fairly plateaued until about 2005, and then it starts to dip. Okay, so we've ended up around, I think that's probably about 16%, so that's obviously declining gradually, whereas China is kind of increasing fairly exponentially. Okay, next graph says the US and Chinese contribution to unadjusted GDP in trillions of US dollars. China is fairly low until about 2000, and then it starts to rise exponentially, and we end up at about 15 trillion in 2015. And then the US, other than when there was like the 2008-2009 global economic crash, does show an increase. It starts at about 2.5 trillion, and it ends up kind of just over 20. Okay, so it says the USA ranks in the top 4 for all but one of the indicators in Table 1, while China ranks in the top 5 for all but 2. The USA is just inside the top 20 for GDP purchasing power parity per capita, whereas China is at rank 104, but at rank 11 for the value of stock of FDI abroad. It says here, you may wish to find out which countries occupy higher positions, and you can visit the CIA World Factbook and click on the country guide to country comparisons and select the appropriate fields and subfields. I'd suggest that is probably not a very good use of your time right now, though. Be aware, GDP purchasing power parity is a broad measure of income, not wealth. Wealth measurements are difficult to calculate, as they would have to include the market value of all of the nation's physical and human resources, as well as capital accumulated over the years in the form of financial reserves and manufactured assets. In 2008, the UN published a report by Cambridge University that attempted to place a value on the wealth of 20 nations, including the USA and China. 3 kinds of asset were included: manufactured or physical, capital, machinery, buildings, infrastructure, and so on; human capital, the population's education and skills; and natural capital, including land, forests, fossil fuels, and minerals. The study placed the USA in first position with a wealth of $117.8 trillion and an average growth rate of 0.7%. China was in third place with a wealth of $20 trillion and an average growth rate of 2.1%. God, there's a lot of numbers there. Right, next section says currency. There's one indicator of a superpower is the extent to which its currency is seen as safe to hold or invest in. A currency that is perceived in this way may acquire the official status of a reserve or anchor currency. Governments and institutions hold significant quantities of a reserve currency in their foreign exchange reserves for international transactions. There are presently 7 recognised major reserve currencies. In order of significance, they are the US dollar, the euro, the British pound sterling, the Japanese yen, the Canadian dollar, the Swiss franc, and the Chinese yuan. Some have also suggested using the international monetary funds, IMF's special drawing rights, or SDRs, as a reserve currency. Issuers of reserve currencies can import goods and services and borrow more easily because they do not have to exchange their currency to make such transactions. This is true for individuals, corporations, and national governments. Okay, next section, the US dollar. The US dollar has been the world's most important reserve currency since the Second World War. The dollar's continuing strength is underpinned by the size and strength of the US economy. The US government has been able to capitalise on the dollar's dominant position, borrowing more cheaply and saving hundreds of billions of dollars in the process. The relative significance of the US dollar against other reserve currencies can be seen in figure 3. I don't know if we can make that any bigger. You might be able to just see it there. So it looks at those other... It's still got the Deutsche Mark in there though, which is madness because obviously that was overtaken by the euro in 1999. So largely most of the relative strength in percentage is all kind of over 60% the US. The yen's fairly consistent as well, but it's a very small percentage. It's probably only about kind of 3 or 4%. Pound sterling is probably less important than the yen, but again it's only kind of 2%-ish. The euro has become obviously increasingly important. That is the green section on the graph, and that has grown to, I would say, maybe about between 15 and 20%. So yeah, it's quite interesting, the relative strength. According to analysts, the US dollar is the most used currency for international payments, accounting for 43.3% of such transactions in 2015. The dollar is widely used and accepted as a second semi-legal currency in many countries around the world, especially in Southeast Asia and South America. It has even been the national currency in Ecuador since 2000, following the crash of the Sucre in 1999-2000. One drawback of a strong currency for the issuing nation is that it makes exports more expensive and foreign imports cheaper, which can heavily impact the balance of trade. The strength of the dollar has varied over the years, declining against the euro from 2002 to 2009, but actually strengthening again in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. Issuers of reserve currencies can wield considerable political as well as financial influence. The global use of the dollar has allowed the US government to take unilateral action against companies and countries that transgress US laws, rules and regulations. This is even the case when the rules do not apply beyond the US's borders, as the following case illustrates. Case study: the US blockade of Cuba. US sanctions against Cuba began in 1960 and lasted for over 50 years. Okay, so if you don't know what sanctions are, basically sanctions are put in place between countries or groups of countries in a country, and it means that no trade at all can happen between those two countries. So it really does kind of polarise the country that has sanctions brought against it. In the past, when South Africa had the apartheid regime, lots of countries had sanctions against them because they didn't agree with their kind of political dealings, so they refused to trade with them. Okay, back to what it says here. It says, Fidel Castro became the Prime Minister of Cuba in 1959, creating a communist state in what had once been a popular destination for American tourists, a trading partner and a political ally. In response to this development, the US President Dwight Eisenhower applied the first sanctions against the island, an arms sales embargo and reduction in Cuban sugar imports. Diplomatic ties were severed completely in 1960, and covert operations began to try to topple the new regime. So Cuba is an island, there's a little map here. It is very close to the tip of Florida, hence why it was quite a popular sort of holiday destination, because you could even get a boat there from Florida. It is kind of, other than the Bahamas,